Hey guys, tonight we are easing ourselves into the soft and steady rhythms of 1830s Lowell in Massachusetts, where you will spend the evening as a young Irish immigrant textile worker settling into your boarding house and your new American routine. It is a world of brick mills, canal bridges, clattering looms, and wooden floors that complain a little every time you walk across them. Most of us today probably would not last 10 minutes in the stiff wool dresses, the early morning chores, or the constant mill whistle that tells you exactly when you should be in motion. But tonight we will move through all of it slowly and gently, with the same cozy feeling you get from being wrapped in a familiar story. Before we drift fully into the past, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There is never any pressure, only a small bit of housekeeping before we get comfortable. Wherever you are listening from, whether it is just past midnight in New York, a late afternoon in California, or an early and quiet morning somewhere far away, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum that settles nicely under a sleepy narration. Let your shoulders drop. Feel your breathing even out. Together, we will step into the calm glow of lamplight shining across a boarding house yard in the early 19th century. You are standing just outside the doorway. The air is cooling as dusk settles over the rows of identical houses. The building behind you is tall but simple, made of clay-colored brick with neat rows of square windows. It is one in a long line of boarding houses built for workers who spend long days in the nearby textile mills. The layout of the neighborhood is crisp and orderly. Straight streets, repeated facades, gardens planted in narrow rectangles. The planners wanted the town to look tidy, and you can feel that intention in the quiet of the evening air. You run your hand along the wooden railing beside the doorway. The wood is worn smooth from years of palms sliding across it. A faint smell of boiled starch drifts through the cracked kitchen windows. Inside, the housemother finishes her last rounds for the night. Her footsteps tap evenly along the hallway. She is known for strict discipline. Curfews are enforced. Chores are assigned. No loud visiting. No rowdy laughter after a certain hour. Historians still argue about how strictly these rules were enforced in every boarding house. Some accounts suggest variety from place to place. Others claim the rules were nearly universal. Whatever the truth, this particular housemother takes her work very seriously. You step back into the warm entry hall. Beeswax polish mixes with the scent of damp wool. The floorboards have their own voices. Some give a long groan when stepped on. Others whisper with a soft creak. These little noises become part of the soundtrack of your nights here, especially when the house settles after dark. A single oil lamp rests on a sideboard, with its glass chimney slightly fogged. The flame sends a trembling glow over a framed print of an English countryside. The image has nothing to do with your life, yet it feels calming. Below the picture sits a tin tray for letters. Every so often a new envelope appears, and the entire house experiences a small burst of anticipation. The letters usually contain news of poor harvests, illnesses, or neighbors who have moved away. Still, a letter is a letter, and any connection to home feels precious. You drift toward the staircase and place your hand on the banister. Upstairs, the shared bedrooms hold narrow beds arranged in even rows. Each bed has a quilt. Some are homemade. Others were bought second-hand from market stalls. Your quilt has squares of faded green that remind you of Ireland. When you first saw it, you felt a small tug at your heart. You did not bring many belongings across the ocean. Only a small trunk with a comb, 2 simple chemises, a shawl from your mother, and a small seashell you found near the harbour before boarding the ship. The muffled sound of conversation travels from one of the rooms. The accents blend in a pleasant way. New England voices, Irish voices like your own, a Scottish girl who hums softly whenever she mends an apron, 2 farm girls from Vermont who still marvel at how large Lowell feels. Conversations wander from payday schedules to complaints about the humidity inside the mill to little jokes about how the overseer always checks his watch as if he can convince time to speed up. Someone mentions that a girl in another boarding house hopes to afford piano lessons. Historians still argue about how often mill workers could afford such luxuries, so the story might be wishful thinking as much as truth. You pause near the front window. Outside, the canal water reflects the last traces of daylight. A cart rattles by and hits the same loose stone in the road that it always does, offering a familiar clunk that makes the window glass tremble. You breathe in the crisp evening air. There is a slight metallic scent from the mills that rises with the breeze. The brick buildings loom in the distance. They do not feel threatening. They feel steady, like a living metronome that keeps time for every person in this part of town. In this moment, you feel yourself settling into a new rhythm. The quiet discipline of the boarding house, the predictable pattern of meals and bells, the mixture of companionship and solitude. These are the textures of your life now. Though you are far from home, tonight you are safe inside these brick walls. You are surrounded by other young workers who are building their futures one long day at a time. The lamp flickers. The floorboards sigh. You breathe deeply and let this world settle around you like a quilt drawn up over your shoulders. You stand at the narrow boarding house window for a moment, watching the last shimmer of canal water fade into twilight. The scene outside settles into a quiet blur of lamplight and brick walls, and it gently nudges you back toward the memories you brought with you across the ocean. The soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the faint murmur of voices upstairs, and the warm smell of starch from the drying room drift together like a tide that carries your thoughts to a different place and a different shore entirely. Tonight, as you settle into this new world, you also let yourself linger for a while in the world you left behind. The memory begins with a still morning in Ireland. You remember the way the sky seemed heavy with mist and pale sunlight, as if the day itself was trying to decide whether it would turn bright or stay grey. You were standing by a small wooden table with your trunk open, and each item you placed inside seemed to echo with its own meaning. A comb polished smooth from years of use. A shawl from your mother that held the faint scent of turf smoke. A simple linen chemise you had mended twice already. A seashell you had picked up on the shore near the harbour, small enough to close entirely in your fist. The shell had tiny ridges that felt like gentle notches against your palm. You held it far longer than you meant to, as if you could store a little piece of home inside its curved surface. You were not the only one leaving. Many families in your village were sending sons or daughters across the sea. Some were leaving because of poor harvests, others because wages were falling, and others for reasons that historians still debate. Some say it was pure economic pressure. Some say it was wanderlust in the younger generation. Others insist that families believed the new factories in New England promised a kind of steady rhythm that older trades no longer offered. Whatever the exact reason, your own departure felt both personal and shared. You belonged to a movement larger than any one traveler, yet it was your own shoes that carried you down the narrow lane toward the waiting boat. You can still feel the uneven stones beneath your feet as you walked with your trunk balanced awkwardly in your hand. It was heavier than you expected, not because of what was inside, but because the act of carrying it forced you to face exactly what you were doing. Your mother walked beside you. She said little, which was her habit when she felt emotions too large to express. She simply kept pace with you, steady and sure. Your father was not able to come all the way to the harbour, but you remembered the warm way he pressed your shoulder that morning and told you to send word whenever you could. The younger brother ran ahead of you on the path, darting in and out of sight like a restless sparrow. He carried nothing but his own excitement at seeing a real ship. The harbour came into view gradually. First the tops of masts, then the white cloth of sails, and finally the wooden hull of the vessel that would take you to America. The air smelled of salt and tar. Gulls circled overhead and made small cries that echoed off the stone harbour walls. People gathered in nervous clusters. Some cried quietly. Some spoke in determined voices that tried to sound cheerful. Others stared at the ship with a faraway look, as though already halfway across the ocean in their minds. You handed your trunk to a deckhand, who stacked it with dozens of others. The moment he lifted it from your hands, you felt an odd mix of lightness and loss, as if a part of you had been tucked away with the luggage. Your mother held your hands in hers. The shawl she had made for you remained draped around your shoulders, gently pulled close as if she could hold you in place by fabric alone. She said the same phrase many Irish mothers said, a phrase that carried blessing and worry in equal measure. You tried to answer without letting your voice shake. There is always a moment when leaving becomes real, and this was that moment for you. The climb onto the ship felt dreamlike. The gangplank creaked beneath your steps, and the rope rails were rough under your fingers. On deck, the crew moved with practiced confidence. Lines were coiled, crates were shifted. A small bell rang 3 times. You found a narrow space near the side of the ship and turned back toward the harbour. Your mother was still there. She lifted her hand. You lifted yours. You held each other in that silent gesture until the ship began to move. The first hours at sea were filled with noise and motion. The ship tilted and rose with the waves, and the wind pulled at your shore. People were settling into cramped quarters below deck. Children were fussing. A few passengers sat on crates, too overwhelmed to move. You breathed deeply and tried to steady yourself. It helped a little to look at the water instead of the rolling deck. The ocean shimmered in a color you had never quite seen at home, a deep, dark green that shifted to silver whenever the light touched it. The days that followed were long. Routine became your anchor. In the mornings you helped sweep the cramped corridors, partly because it needed doing, and partly because it gave you something familiar to lean on. Meals were plain and predictable: boiled potatoes, salted fish, hard bread that required patience to chew, yet there was comfort in the sameness. People shared small stories. Someone taught you a simple song to pass the time. Children invented games with bits of rope and coin. There were long hours when the sea stretched out in every direction, calm enough to create a strange sense of floating in place. During those hours, you often reached into your pocket and touched the small seashell. The ridges reminded you that land still existed somewhere behind you. At night, the ship settled into a hush. The boards creaked softly. The ocean made a slow and endless murmur beneath the hull. This sound was steady and soothing. You would lie awake and imagine the outline of Lowell. You knew very little about it then, only that it had brick mills, boarding houses, and wages. But you pictured it anyway, the way travelers sometimes picture destinations they have never seen. Historians still debate how much information immigrants truly had about mill towns before arriving. Some say people knew only the basics. Others argue that newspapers and letters painted detailed pictures. The truth likely lived somewhere between the two. The crossing ended quietly. One morning, the bells rang differently. Passengers stirred with a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. You climbed to the deck and saw the faint shape of land rising through a light haze. Boston appeared slowly, with wooden piers, warehouses, and buildings that looked both familiar and foreign. You felt a rush of too many emotions to name: excitement, fear, curiosity, hunger, hope. You had done it. You had crossed the ocean. And now, standing in the boardinghouse window in Lowell, those memories feel distant but still connected to the person you are becoming. You breathe in the warm scent of starch. You listen to the faint sounds of girls settling in for the night. And you feel the same small seashell in your pocket. Its ridges are exactly as they were that day on the Irish shore. You close your eyes for a moment. The memory settles gently. The room grows still. And you prepare yourself for what comes next in this new life. You remain near the boarding house window for a quiet moment, and the cool air that slides in through the narrow gap in the frame seems to whisper with the memory of wind over open water. The night outside is still, but in your mind you are back on the deck of the ship that carried you across the Atlantic. The memory arrives softly, like a tide that does not rush but slowly returns. The boarding house kitchen sends up a faint clatter of pans. Someone upstairs laughs in a muffled way, yet none of that pulls you out of the moment. Instead, the sounds blend gently with the ocean recollection, as if both worlds can sit beside each other without conflict. You remember stepping below deck on the first day of the voyage. The stairs were narrow, the wood slightly damp, and the air heavy with a mix of sea salt and old rope that had known too many storms. The space was cramped even when it was empty. Once all the passengers crowded in, it felt like a long tunnel of humanity packed into wooden ribs. Families clustered together. Young travelers like you were shown small bunks against the walls. Each bunk had a thin mattress stuffed with coarse fibers. The fabric was rough and scratchy to the touch. You did not mind it at first. You were simply too overwhelmed to care about comfort. The lanterns that hung from the beams flickered every time the ship rolled. Their warm light threw shadows that wandered across the ceiling in slow waves. The motion of the shadows matched the motion of the sea, up and down, side to side, always patient. A few people whispered prayers under their breath. Others muttered that they were already feeling queasy. You tried to breathe through the rocking and focus on small details. The smooth surface of the seashell in your pocket, the faint squeak of rope against iron rings, the soft sound of water brushing against the hull. These little sensations helped you find your balance. On the second day, the wind grew restless, though the crew insisted it was nothing special. The The deckhands moved through the aisles with the mechanical ease of men who had done this hundreds of times. They knew which crates needed shifting. They knew how to brace themselves when the ship leaned. Their presence gave you confidence. Even so, you felt the tilt of the world under your feet. Your stomach tightened. You gripped the edge of your bunk to steady yourself. A woman nearby tried to hum a song to her child. The tune wavered with each roll of the ship, but she kept singing. The sound soothed you more than you expected. Meals were served in simple ways. A bucket of boiled potatoes passed from person to person, a wooden bowl of salted meat that required more chewing than anyone cared to admit. Bread that had gone hard long before it reached the ship. You ate slowly, partly because the food demanded patience, and partly because you did not want to upset your uneasy stomach. People complained in quiet voices. No one had the energy for drama. Hunger was shared, and that turned it into something strangely comforting. You understood exactly how everyone else felt, because they understood exactly how you felt too. Days blurred together in a rhythm that was both dull and peaceful. You would wake to the same creak of beams, the same shuffle of feet, the same call of crewmen above deck. You would sit by the small porthole if you could claim the spot early enough. Through that circle of glass you watched the ocean stretch toward the horizon in every direction. The water changed color with the sky. Sometimes blue, sometimes gray, sometimes a silver green that looked almost unreal. The surface was rarely still, yet the constant motion had a hypnotic quality. You would lose track of time simply watching waves lift and fall in an endless procession. One afternoon you stood near the railing on the upper deck. The air was cold but refreshing. Small droplets of salt water clung to your sleeves where the breeze carried them. You listened to the creaking of the masts and the whisper of the sails as they strained gently against the wind. A few gulls followed the ship for a while. Their wings caught the sunlight, turning white and bright as polished bone. A crew member explained that gulls often follow ships for easy food. He said it with a grin as if this were a joke he had told 100 times. It was a small moment, yet it stayed with you. There was something reassuring about those birds who seemed to know the way better than you did. Evenings brought a different kind of calm. Lanterns glowed along the deck. People made small attempts at normal routines. Someone stitched a torn sleeve. Someone else mended a broken shoelace. A girl from County Clare played a tin whistle with a quiet and shaky confidence. The notes drifted through the air like threads of sound, weaving a soft sense of community among the passengers. You often sat close enough to hear clearly, but far enough to pretend you were listening for your own sake and not hers. Music on a ship feels different from music on land. The ocean seems to cradle it. The waves carry it. It feels shared even when it is private. Historians still debate what daily life on immigrant ships was truly like. Some accounts emphasize hardship and poor conditions. Others point out that many crossings were uneventful and as safe as the technology of the time allowed. The truth likely sits somewhere between those extremes. You remember discomfort, yes. You also remember long stretches of quiet that felt surprisingly peaceful. Moments of boredom that became moments of rest. Tiny social rituals that made the ship feel like a temporary town drifting over an endless plain of moving water. There were quirks to ship life that you still think about fondly, like the man who carved small animals out of bits of driftwood he found wedged in the deck boards, or the woman who insisted on brushing her hair every morning no matter how cramped the quarters were. Or the small group who gathered near the stern each evening to tell stories about saints, pirates, or long-lost villages. You did not join every conversation, but you listened closely. Their voices rose and fell in gentle patterns, soothing enough to fall asleep to if the ship had remained still. One night stands out more than the others. The ocean had calmed to a gentle rocking. The sky was full of stars that looked close enough to touch. You leaned against the railing with your shawl wrapped tightly around you. The cold air bit at your cheeks, but you barely noticed. The sea below was dark and glossy. It reflected the stars in scattered points of light. The boundary between water and sky seemed to dissolve. You felt small in a way that was not frightening. Instead, it felt like a reminder that the world was wide and that you were traveling through it in a way you had never imagined before. It was a moment of quiet awe, one you did not speak of, but one that stayed with you even after reaching land. When the ship finally approached Boston, the passengers crowded the deck to see the new world appear. Some cried, some cheered, some fell into thoughtful silence. You remember feeling all three emotions at once. The city rose from the water with warehouses, church spires, and rows of houses that created a skyline unlike anything you had seen before. You felt your pulse quicken. The seashell in your pocket felt warm from your hand. Now, back in the boarding house window with the soft glow of lamplight at your feet, you let the memory settle. The ocean feels far away, yet the sensations remain ready to be recalled. The rocking ship, the quiet meals, the calm evenings of lantern light on wood. These memories have shaped the person who stands here now, breathing the warm scent of starch and listening to girls preparing for bed. You take one more long breath. The ocean fades again. The boarding house returns, and you are ready to move deeper into your new life in Lowell. The memory of the ocean fades like a tide slipping gently back into itself, and you find your thoughts settling on the moment your feet first touched solid ground in Boston. The boarding house room around you is warm and dim, but the memory feels sharp and bright. You remember it clearly. The bustle of the harbor, the smell of salt mixed with coal smoke, the clamor of carts and voices and gulls that seemed far louder than anything you had heard at sea. It was not only noise, it was a kind of announcement. You had arrived, you had crossed the ocean, and the world ahead of you was already in motion. You recall stepping onto the wooden pier. The boards were uneven and damp, and they creaked beneath the weight of passengers who hurried off the ship with a mix of relief and urgency. Some kissed the ground. Some laughed. Some looked around in wild confusion. You stood still for a long moment because your legs felt strange after so many days of rocking. The earth was steady. Too steady. It took a little while for your balance to trust it again. A dock worker shouted instructions to someone carrying crates. A pair of boys ran past you with baskets of fish that dripped water onto the boards. A woman selling apples called out in a voice that easily carried above the crowd. The air smelled of wood smoke, tar, wet rope, and the sweet aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. That smell, warm and earthy, made you feel calm in an unexpected way. It reminded you of autumn evenings at home, even though everything else around you looked so different. You followed the flow of travelers toward the edge of the harbor. You clutched your small trunk with both hands. It felt heavier than you remembered. People pressed close in all directions. Some wore clothes finer than anything you had ever touched. Others looked as disheveled and travel-worn as you felt. A few spoke English with accents you could not quite place. Historians still debate how many languages echoed through Boston streets in these years. Some claim the city was already a patchwork of dialects. Others say it was only beginning to take shape as a multilingual hub. Whatever the truth, the soundscape of that morning was a lively mix that made your head spin a little. You walked until the crowd thinned and the street widened. The cobblestones were uneven, and you had to watch your step to avoid catching your shoe on a raised edge. Shops lined the street. A bakery with its door propped open. A tinsmith hammering something that rang like a bell. A tailor who stood outside brushing lint from a coat and calling out his prices. You moved slowly, partly because you wanted to see everything and partly because the city felt like a puzzle you needed time to understand. You had been told that the mill companies often placed advertisements or notices about hiring. So your plan was simple. Follow the streets, look for signs, ask for directions if needed. Of course, many newcomers were doing the same thing, so the sidewalks were filled with young men and women who looked just as uncertain as you. A few traded knowing smiles when their eyes met yours, as if to say that you were all wandering through the same confusing maze. There was comfort in that. Even in a strange place, the presence of fellow travelers made you feel less alone. You turned a corner and found yourself in front of a building that stood taller than the rest. Its doorway was framed by 2 stone pillars. Inside, you could see a narrow hallway lined with benches. People were waiting there. Some clutched papers. Others looked nervously at the floor or whispered questions to each other. This was one of the hiring offices. You knew it instantly. The air inside seemed to vibrate with anticipation. A clerk sat behind a tall desk near the back wall. His ink pot, quill, and stack of papers made him look like a gatekeeper to a new life. You stepped inside. The floor creaked. As you moved to an empty bench, you felt your stomach tighten. The clerk called names from a list. Some people stepped forward confidently. Others hesitated. When your turn came, you approached his desk with your trunk still in hand. He did not ask for your name at first. Instead, he asked if you were healthy, if you could read a little. If you understood that mill work required long hours. His tone was crisp, not unfriendly, just efficient. You answered as best you could, aware that your voice trembled a little. He made a small note on a paper, then handed you another sheet that listed the boarding houses affiliated with the company. The office smelled of dust and ink. The clerk told you that transport would be arranged to Lowell. You were to report back the next morning. You thanked him in a quiet voice and stepped aside so the next applicant could move forward. Your hands shook slightly when you sat down again. Not out of fear, not exactly. More out of a sudden understanding that everything was now real. You had thought about millwork in the abstract, but here it was on paper, signed and stamped, the start of your new life. When you left the building, the air felt colder than before. A breeze swept in from the harbour and tugged gently at your shawl. You walked without much aim, trying to absorb everything at once. The clatter of hooves, the clink of a blacksmith hammering iron, a woman sweeping dust from her shop doorway, the call of sailors unloading cargo from a nearby ship. The city felt alive in a way that made your pulse quicken. You felt small, but not lost. Someone pointed you toward a street where a coach would take new mill workers to a temporary lodging house for the night. You followed their instructions and found a modest wagon waiting with 2 horses that looked patient and unimpressed by the bustle around them. You joined a few other travelers in climbing aboard. They asked where you were from. You asked the same in return. One girl said she had been a farm servant in County Limerick. Another said she had worked as a spinner in Manchester before crossing the ocean. Their accents shifted the air around you into something familiar and warm. The coach lurched forward with a soft jolt. As it moved through the streets, you watched Boston slide past in glimpses, church spires rising above rooftops, laundry lines hanging behind cramped backyards, a group of boys kicking a battered ball down an alley, a woman carrying a basket of bread wrapped in cloth. It all moved by in a series of small scenes, each one new, each one slightly overwhelming. Historians still argue about how intimidating these first moments in American cities were for immigrants. Some claim people adapted quickly and felt at ease within days. Others insist that the culture shock lasted far longer. You suspect both are true, depending on the traveler. For you, the city felt enormous and noisy, yet you also felt a strange calm. It was as if your mind said, yes, this is unfamiliar, but you have already crossed an ocean. You can handle this too. By the time you reached the temporary lodging house, the light was fading. A lantern hung beside the door. It flickered in the wind and cast a gentle glow over a row of chairs lined up on the porch. Inside, the rooms were small but clean. You placed your trunk beside your bed and exhaled a long breath you had been holding for hours. The floorboards were solid. The walls were close. The world felt steady again. That night you lay awake for a long time, replaying the sights and sounds of Boston in your mind. You pictured the harbour, the shops, the hiring office, and the faces of the other girls in the coach. You wondered what Lowell would look like. You wondered how loud the mills truly were. You wondered if you would make friends there, or if the boarding houses would feel lonely. But beneath all those questions was a steady certainty that you had done the right thing. Now, standing in your real boarding house in Lowell, years later, the memory feels like the opening chapter of a story that has already begun to unfold. You breathe in the warm scent of the room. You listen to light footsteps on the stairs, and you feel a quiet gratitude for the girl who stepped into bustling Boston without knowing exactly where the road ahead would lead. You stand beside your narrow boarding house bed for a moment, feeling the wooden floor warm beneath your wool stockings from the heat that rises through the building after supper. The light outside has faded into a gentle blue-grey, and the room carries that soft heaviness that comes when people are winding down after a long day. The memory of Boston is still drifting through your mind, but here in Lowell you begin to sense the rhythms that shape your new life. The sound of a distant mill whistle cuts through the evening air, faint but clear enough to remind you exactly where you are. The whistles are the heartbeat of this place, and it is time for you to learn their language. At first, every whistle sounds the same, a loud blast followed by echoing silence. But after a few days, you start to recognize their distinct voices. One calls the beginning of the workday in the mills. Another signals the midday meal. Another marks the end of the shift. One serves as a warning that curfew is near. The tones vary in length and pitch. Some are higher, some lower. Some last only a few moments. Others stretch long enough to vibrate through the window glass. The girls in your boarding house joke that they can tell the time better by the whistles than by any clock. You smile when they say it because you feel the truth of it. The schedule becomes part of your body. You wake before the morning call. You feel hungry just before the midday one. You grow drowsy as the evening whistle drifts over the rooftops like a final exhale. During your first week in Lowell, you follow the others closely. You do not want to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The house mother watches everything. She has a calm face but firm eyes. She taps her foot when people move too slowly at breakfast. She clears her throat loudly when the conversation becomes too lively. She recites the rules every Sunday evening: curfew at 9, proper dress at meals, no visitors without permission. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were followed. Some claim that boarding houses varied widely in how rigid or lenient they were. Others say the rules were the backbone of Milltown respectability. Whatever the truth, in this house the rules feel solid and predictable, like the bricks that hold the building together. In the mornings, you descend the stairs in a stream of wool dresses and pinned hair. The breakfast room smells of porridge and fresh bread. Steam rises from tin mugs of tea. Conversations are gentle at this hour. A few yawns escape. Someone comments on the weather. Someone else mentions that her bobbin broke 3 times the day before. The simple routine has comfort hidden inside it. The warmth of the food, the steady scrape of chair legs on the floor, the peaceful hush before the day begins. You sit with your small portion and let the warmth settle in your stomach, preparing you for hours of noise and heat inside the mill. When the morning whistle sounds again, the entire boarding house moves at once. Girls gather shawls, tie aprons, and head out the door in a loose procession. The street is filled with other workers doing the same. The air is crisp. The canal reflects the rising sun. The mills stand tall and purposeful ahead of you. You join the line entering the building, and for a moment you feel the weight of the day press lightly against your thoughts. But then you take a breath and remind yourself that this is what you came for. Work, wages, a chance to send money home. Inside the mill, the noise envelops you. The first time you heard it, you felt a jolt of shock. You had never imagined sound so constant and powerful. Looms clattered, belts hummed, threads snapped. Machinery clicked in endless patterns. But after a few days, the noise becomes familiar. Not pleasant exactly, but rhythmic, a pattern your mind can settle into. You learn to move with the machines. Your hands become steady. Your eyes adjust to the motion of thread and shuttle. You fall into a pace that feels almost meditative. The air is warm and humid because humidity keeps the threads from breaking. It makes your skin feel sticky. It makes your hair curl at the edges. You accept it as part of the day. During the midday meal, the workers gather in the corporate dining hall. The food is simple: bread, stew, tea. The room buzzes with quiet talk. People discuss their families, their wages, their plans. You sit with a few girls from your boarding house and listen more than you speak. You do not want to say anything foolish, but one girl with light brown hair and freckles asks where you are from, and you tell her the name of your village. She nods as if she has heard it before, even if she has not. That tiny gesture feels like belonging. After the meal, the afternoon whistle sends everyone back to work. The heat rises again. The rhythm of the looms settles into your bones. By the time the final whistle of the day signals your release, your legs ache and your ears ring softly. You leave the building with a wave of exhausted workers. The sun is low. The air cools your cheeks. The canal water moves slowly under the wooden footbridge. You breathe deeply and let the outside world fill your senses after hours in the mill. Evenings in the boarding house feel quiet and soft. Some girls sew by lamplight. Others read from small books passed between them. A few write letters. You sit on your bed and unfold a sheet of paper. Your handwriting is careful. You tell your family that you are well. You tell them the work is tiring but steady. You tell them you are sending a portion of your wages as soon as possible. The pen strokes feel meaningful. The idea that money you earn will cross the ocean to help your family gives you a quiet satisfaction. It makes every long day feel worthwhile. The house mother walks the hallway at 9. She taps on doors. She calls for lights to be lowered. The curfew whistle sounds in the distance. A soft wave of calm washes over the building. Girls whisper goodnight. Someone hums a tune as she folds her apron. The floorboards creak in familiar patterns. You lie down beneath your faded quilt and close your eyes. The sound of the mill still hums faintly in your ears, as if your mind continues weaving even in the dark. You do not know yet how long you will stay in Lowell. You do not know how many letters you will send home or how many friendships you will form in these narrow rooms. But you feel a growing sense that you are part of something larger than yourself. A rhythm, a pattern, a community shaped by whistles, rules, meals, and shared sleepiness at the end of each long day. And as your breath slows, you imagine the faint outline of Ireland drifting far behind you, not lost but gently resting in the memory of the girl who first boarded the ship. You are someone new now, and the steady pulse of Lowell has begun to write itself into your life with each passing hour. You sit on the edge of your narrow boarding-house bed for a moment and let the familiar sounds around you settle into the stillness of the night. Someone in the hallway sets a cup on a wooden table. A door closes with a gentle click. A girl upstairs hums softly to herself as she brushes out her hair. These small sounds seem to blend with the memory rising in your thoughts. The memory of the day you first entered the hiring offices that served as the gateway between the city of Boston and the mill town of Lowell. You close your eyes and return to that moment. The first thing you remember is the way the hiring building stood taller than its neighbors. It did not look grand, exactly. It looked official. The walls were plain, the windows narrow, but there was a seriousness in the air around it, something that made your steps slow as you approached the entrance. Others were walking toward the same doorway. Their faces held the same mixture of nerves and hope that you felt in your chest. Inside, the air smelled of ink, dust, and wool coats that had been kept too close together. The hallway was crowded with people sitting or standing in uneven lines. Some clutched small bundles of belongings. Others held letters of introduction or scraps of paper with their names written in careful strokes. A clerk at a tall desk called people forward one at a time. His voice was sharp and clear. The scrape of his quill across paper created a steady rhythm. You remember sitting on a narrow bench with your trunk resting against your legs. The wood felt cool against your ankles. You held your hands clasped on your lap and tried not to fidget. No one spoke loudly. Most people whispered. A few sat in silent prayer. The tension in the room felt almost physical, like the air was holding its breath along with everyone else. You could hear your own heartbeat in your ears. You could feel each inhale and exhale. The weight of the moment pressed against your ribs. When the clerk called your name, your legs felt a little unsteady. The floorboards creaked beneath your steps as you approached his desk. He did not smile, but he did not scowl either. His expression was one of practiced neutrality. He had seen hundreds of hopeful workers before you. He asked questions in a voice that sounded both direct and hurried. Were you healthy? Could you read a little? Did you understand the demands of mill work? Had you traveled with family or alone? You answered each question as clearly as you could. You tried to keep your voice even. The clerk wrote notes on a sheet of paper with quick strokes. Historians still debate how rigorous these examinations were. Some say the clerks accepted nearly everyone because the mills needed labor. Others insist that certain standards were enforced to maintain productivity. The truth probably varies from one hiring office to another. In your case, the clerk seemed mostly concerned that you could endure long days on your feet and follow instructions without complaint. When he finished writing, he handed you a folded sheet. It listed the boarding houses with available rooms. It also included the date and time you were expected to report for transport to Lowell. He tapped the top of the paper with his finger in a gesture that suggested finality. You nodded, thanked him quietly, and stepped away from the desk. You returned to the bench and sat down, feeling the weight of the moment settle across your shoulders. Not a heavy weight, more like a realization. You had passed the first threshold. You had been accepted. You would soon be earning wages. A small but important part of your journey had begun. When you stepped outside the hiring office, the sunlight startled you. The street felt brighter and louder than it had before. It was as if you had walked from one world into another. The crowd outside moved with restless energy. Carts rattled past. Street vendors shouted prices. The smell of fresh bread floated from a bakery nearby. You stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a moment, letting the sunlight warm your face, and tried to absorb everything at once. You walked slowly along the street, holding your paper carefully so the wind would not snatch it from your hand. This sheet represented your next step. You read it again and again, even though you already knew what it said. It told you where to go. It told you when to be there. It told you that the journey was moving forward. By midday, you found yourself standing near a modest inn where the transport wagon would meet new workers. Several girls were already sitting outside. Some were eating small pieces of bread they had purchased from a vendor. Others were comparing notes on their future boarding houses. You introduced yourself to the girl sitting beside you. She had freckles across her cheeks and a warm smile that made you feel immediately at ease. She asked where you came from. You asked the same. These small exchanges were tiny handholds in a world that still felt too large to navigate alone. When the wagon finally arrived, the driver called out for mill workers heading to Lowell. You climbed aboard with the other girls. The wooden seat was hard beneath you. The wagon jostled as it moved along the uneven streets. You clutched your trunk to keep it from sliding. As the city passed by in a blur of buildings, chimneys, laundry lines, and shop windows, you felt something shift inside you. It was not fear. It was not relief. It was a quiet acceptance that your life had already changed. The road toward Lowell grew smoother as the city fell behind you. The air smelled fresher. Trees lined parts of the route. Birds flew overhead in slow arcs. You listened to the other girls talk about what they had heard of the mills. Some claimed the noise was overwhelming. Others said you got used to it quickly. Some spoke of wages. Others spoke of savings. One girl said she hoped to send money home for her younger sister. You listened closely and felt a soft connection forming among the group. When the wagon finally reached Lowell, the first sight of the mills took your breath for a moment. Tall brick buildings rose along the canal. Water rushed through the raceways. Wooden bridges crossed the narrow channels. Workers moved along the streets in steady streams. The sound of distant machinery created a low hum that vibrated through the ground. It was overwhelming and fascinating all at once. Now, in your boarding house room, you breathe slowly as the memory fades. You understand the whistles. You understand the rules. You understand the routine. But this moment, the moment of your arrival, still feels vivid. It was the day you stepped from the uncertainty of travel into the structure of mill life. A day shaped by crowded rooms, waiting benches, sharp ink smells, and the quiet courage required to speak clearly to a clerk who held your future in his quill. You inhale the warm scent of the boarding house again. You exhale slowly. You feel a soft ache of gratitude for the girl who walked into that hiring office with a steady heart, prepared for whatever came next. You sit on the edge of your boarding house bed for a moment and let the last echo of evening voices fade through the hallway. Lamps burn low. Quilts rustle softly. A girl upstairs coughs once, the kind of small sound that settles back into the warm hush of the house without disturbing anything. As your eyes drift toward the window, the memory of your first weeks in Lowell rises again. Not the journey or the hiring office this time, but the strange new rhythm you had to learn. A rhythm built not by clocks or seasons, but by the commands of the factory whistles. The whistles controlled everything. When to wake, when to walk, when to eat, when to return, when to sleep. At first, the pattern felt overwhelming. The blasts were loud enough to cut through dreams. They rattled glass panes. They startled birds from the trees along the canal. You remember your very first morning in the boarding house, when the pre-dawn whistle tore through the quiet and you bolted upright, convinced something terrible had happened. A girl in the next bed laughed gently and told you that you would get used to it before long. She said everyone did. You were not sure you believed her at the time. In those early days, you lay awake long after the whistle sounded, waiting for your heartbeat to slow. You stared at the faint lines of moonlight across the wooden ceiling. You listened to the creak of feet on the stairway. Eventually you rose, washed in the cold basin, dressed as quickly as possible, and joined the sleepy procession of workers heading toward breakfast. Your feet ached from the unfamiliar shoes. Your shoulders felt stiff from a mattress that was softer than the one at home but strangely less forgiving. Everything about your routine felt different, yet each small change was part of a larger structure that slowly became familiar. After breakfast, another whistle called you to the mill. The sound echoed off the brick walls and rippled across the canal water. The group of workers moved in a slow but steady wave. Feet scuffed over cobblestones. Shawls fluttered behind you in the cool morning air. The walk to the mill felt short and long at the same time. Short because the building stood so close to the boarding houses. Long because the knowledge of what awaited you pressed quietly against your thoughts. Inside the mill, the day transformed into something entirely different. The noise swallowed everything. You could not speak without leaning close to someone. You could not even hear your own footsteps on the wooden floor. The machines created a wall of sound that seemed to fold in on itself endlessly. Looms snapped threads into motion. Belts spun in smooth, relentless arcs. Wooden frames thudded in patterns that repeated so steadily you sometimes felt your breath matching the rhythm. Work in the mill required its own kind of learning. You had to watch the shuttle slide across the warp threads. You had to replace empty bobbins quickly. You had to feel the tension in the fibers with your fingertips. The air in the weaving room was warm and heavy with moisture. You sometimes found it hard to breathe during the first hour of the day, but your body adapted. Your lungs adjusted to the humid air. Your eyes learned to track the rapid motion without growing dizzy. Your hands grew nimble and sure. The midday whistle always came as a small relief. It cut through the noise of the machines and signaled a brief pause. You stepped away from the loom and walked with the others to the corporate dining hall. The quiet of that room felt strange. Not silent exactly, but muted compared to the roar of the mill. The food was simple: bread, potatoes, stew, tea. You ate slowly, letting your muscles rest. People chatted in low voices. Someone complained about a broken thread. Someone else shared a rumor about wage changes that might be coming. Historians often note that rumors in mill towns spread with surprising speed, even without newspapers or telegraphs. Word of mouth carried more meaning than printed pages sometimes. The afternoon shift began with another whistle. You returned to your station and worked until the final blast of the day. That last whistle always sounded different. Even if the tone was the same, your body reacted to it with immediate relief. Your shoulders loosened, your legs relaxed. You remembered you had a voice again after hours of silence. The walk home felt softer. The mill air clung to your dress and hair. The scent of oil and cotton lingered on your sleeves. You crossed the bridge over the canal and watched sunlight play across the rippling water. You felt tired, deeply tired, but also steady. The routine, though demanding, gave your days structure. Your evenings were shaped by smaller schedules: supper at a set time, quiet sewing circles, reading lessons for those who wanted to improve their literacy. Some girls read aloud to practice. Others wrote letters in careful script. You often joined them and wrote to your family, telling them about the whistles and the routine. You kept your letters hopeful because you wanted them to feel proud. You did not mention how exhausting the first weeks were. You knew they would worry. Curfew arrived with a sense of ritual. The house mother walked the halls. Lamps dimmed. Rooms quieted. The final whistle of the mill echoed faintly through the night, even though it had sounded hours earlier. Your ears carried a ghost version of the noise long after the machines were still. Some girls joked that they heard the music of the looms even in their dreams. You laughed with them because you knew exactly what they meant. Eventually you learned each whistle by sound alone. The morning whistle had a sharp, quick quality. The midday whistle felt rounder. The end-of-day whistle sounded a touch deeper, as if the machinery itself sighed along with it. You could tell them apart even without seeing the sky outside. Your body responded before your thoughts did. You woke before the morning blast. You felt hunger moments before the midday call. Your arms tingled with relief when the final whistle rang through the city. There was comfort in this rhythm, predictable, steady, even soothing in its own way. Yes, it was demanding. Yes, it left you tired, but it also gave you a sense of belonging. You followed the same schedule as the girls beside you. You worked the same hours. You rested at the same time. You shared the same exhaustion and the same small victories. Historians still debate whether mill workers found this rigid structure oppressive or grounding. Some claim it stripped workers of freedom. Others say it created stability that many had never known. For you, the truth rests somewhere in the middle. The whistles controlled you, but they also guided you. They told you when to act and when to pause. In a strange new place, the pattern felt almost like a friend. Tonight, as you sit on your bed with the boarding house settling into silence, you can still hear the memory of those whistles in your mind. They blend with the creak of the old floor and the soft breathing of the girls around you. The routine is no longer strange. It is part of you now, woven into your days just as tightly as thread is woven into cloth. You take a slow breath and let the memory slide gently into the quiet of the room. The whistles rest for the night, but their rhythm continues inside you, steady and familiar, guiding you into sleep and preparing you for the next part of your journey. You rest your hands on the small writing table beside your bed and feel the smooth surface beneath your fingertips. The lamplight glows softly across the room, warm and buttery, turning the shadows along the wall into gentle curves. The boarding house is quiet now. Only a few whispers drift through the hallway. Someone turns a page in a book. Someone else coughs lightly before settling into sleep. It is in these peaceful moments that your thoughts turn to the idea that shaped your hopes long before you left Ireland. The idea of sending money home. You remember the first time you heard other workers talk about their wages. You had been in Lowell only a few days. The mills were still overwhelming. The whistles still startled you. The routine felt like a puzzle that was slowly arranging itself. But during a midday meal in the dining hall, a girl with bright eyes and quick hands asked if you planned to send part of your pay to your family. She spoke casually as she tore a piece of bread in half. She explained that many workers did exactly that. Some sent a portion every month. Others saved for several months before sending a larger sum. You felt your heart lift at the idea. It was the reason you had come, to help your family, to make their lives easier, to return something for all they had given you. You spent the rest of the meal quietly listening. The girl explained how pay was collected. Every pay period, workers lined up before the company agent. Each person received a small envelope or paper slip that recorded hours worked, deductions, and the final amount owed. The wages were not large, but they were steady. And steady work meant steady help for the people you loved. The girl also mentioned that some workers used banks in town to send money. Others trusted ship captains, missionaries, or family friends traveling back to Ireland. The methods varied, and each came with its own risks. Historians still debate how reliable these systems were. Some claim that early banking services made remittances more secure. Others argue that trust networks among immigrants were far more dependable. The truth likely depended on where you lived and who you knew. When your first payday arrived, you felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The line of workers stretched down the hallway of the mill office. People chatted in soft voices. Someone said her mother depended on these wages. Someone else said he was saving to marry. You clutched your shawl around your shoulders and tried to keep your hands from trembling. The clerk called out each name with a steady rhythm. When your name finally echoed through the room, you stepped forward and accepted your small envelope. The weight of it in your hand felt strange. Light, yet full of meaning. You found a quiet corner in the boarding house that evening and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded slip of paper and a few coins wrapped in cloth. The slip listed your hours. You traced the numbers with your fingertip. For a moment you felt a surge of disbelief. You had worked so hard, and now here was the proof. You had earned this money. You had done something new and difficult. You felt a kind of pride warm your chest. You placed the coins on the table and looked at them closely. The metal glinted softly in the lamplight. You imagined your mother holding these coins. You imagined her buying flour, candles, or cloth with the money you earned. The thought filled you with a strange mix of joy and sorrow. Joy because you could help. Sorrow because you were so far away. Over the next few days, you spoke with the older girls in the boarding house to learn how they sent their wages. Some walked to the bank on a quiet street near the canal. The bank was a modest building with wooden counters and a clerk who explained the process with careful patience. Others passed their money through trusted intermediaries. A few had friends in local Irish groups who organized collections and ensured the funds reached families overseas. You decided to visit the bank. The morning was cool and clear. The canal shimmered under the sunlight. You crossed a wooden bridge and listened to the water rushing through the raceways. The mill buildings towered above you with their tall chimneys stretching into the sky. When you reached the bank, you stepped inside with your envelope tucked safely beneath your shawl. The room smelled of ink, leather, and old paper. The clerk examined your slip and nodded. He asked where the money needed to go. You gave him your family name and village. He wrote everything down with neat strokes. He explained that the money would travel through a network of offices until it reached a port agent in Ireland. From there, it would be given to your family. You thanked him quietly and stepped back into the sunlight with an odd mixture of relief and worry. Relief that the process had begun. Worry because the journey for the money was long and uncertain. For days afterward, you thought of the coins moving across the ocean. You imagined them traveling from hand to hand, through offices, onto ships, across waters that still echoed in your memory. You hoped your family would receive the money safely. You hoped the letter you had written to accompany it would reach them. You had folded the letter carefully. You told them about the mills. You told them about the whistles. You told them that you were well and strong. You did not mention the exhaustion or the noise. You did not want them to worry. Weeks passed. You settled more deeply into the rhythm of your work. You learned to tie apron strings faster. You learned to recognize the first faint note of a whistle before it fully sounded. You learned which streets stayed quiet in the evenings and which ones filled with chatter. Through it all, the thought of your family receiving your wages brought you quiet comfort. One evening, as the girls gathered around the sewing table, the house mother entered with a small bundle of letters. She called out names one by one. When she said yours, your breath caught. You reached for the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was familiar. You carried the letter to your bed and sat down carefully, as if the slightest motion might disturb the words inside. You broke the seal gently and unfolded the page. Your mother had written to tell you that the money had arrived. She thanked you in words that made your eyes grow warm. She said the money helped them buy coal and flour and a few small comforts. She said she kept your seashell on the kitchen shelf where the light caught it at noon. She told you that she prayed for you every night. She said that your strength was her strength. You read the letter 3 times before you slipped it under your pillow. Historians sometimes argue about how much money immigrants sent home and how important those funds were. Some say the remittances supported entire communities. Others say the amounts were small but symbolic. To you, it did not matter what scholars would one day debate. What mattered was the feeling in your chest as you held the letter. The knowledge that your work had reached across an ocean. The knowledge that you were still part of your family's life, even from a distance. Tonight you set down your quill and quietly fold your hands. You think about the girl who stepped into the bank that morning, nervous and uncertain. You think about the woman you are becoming, shaped by responsibility and quiet determination. You breathe deeply and feel a steady sense of pride settle in your heart. Sending money home is a ritual now, a promise, a rhythm, as steady as the mill whistles and as comforting as the soft rustle of quilts in the boarding house. You let the memory close gently, like the final page of a letter. The lamplight flickers, the boarding house grows still, and you rest in the knowledge that your work carries meaning far beyond these 4 walls. The boarding house has grown so quiet that you can hear the faint hum of the oil lamp as it warms the air around the glass chimney. Your quilt lies folded neatly at the foot of your bed. The wooden floor beneath your shoes carries the gentle warmth of the kitchen fire below. Outside, a soft breeze touches the window pane. It is the kind of night that invites memories of places that were still even when the rest of the world was in full motion. As you sit in this calm room, the memory of an abandoned mill floor rises within you, a place that once echoed with sound but now rests in perfect silence. You remember the day you ventured there. It began as an ordinary afternoon. You had finished your tasks early and had been asked to deliver a small bundle of thread to a supervisor on another floor. When you reached the stairway, you noticed that the door to the unused level above was slightly ajar. You had heard stories about that floor. Some said it had been shut down because the machines were too old. Others whispered that the floor had once been damaged by a small fire. Historians still debate how common mill fires were. Some argue that they happened often. Others claim they were rare but feared. Whatever the true reason, the floor was no longer in use, and curiosity tugged at you gently. You stepped up the narrow stairs, placing your hand on the railing to steady yourself. The wood felt dry and dusty, as if no one had touched it in years. When you reached the landing, you nudged the door open. It creaked in a long, tired voice. The room beyond was dim, lit only by thin strips of daylight slipping through tall windows. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight. The air felt heavy and still. You stepped inside slowly. The wooden floorboards dipped slightly under your weight. Rows of machines stood motionless, covered in a thin layer of dust that softened their sharp edges. Looms with empty frames, warping tools, shuttles resting in their slots like birds that had tucked their heads under their wings. You had seen these machines alive and roaring many times before, but seeing them here, quiet and untouched, filled you with a sense of reverence. It felt like walking into a church after everyone had gone home. You moved deeper into the room, careful not to disturb anything. The silence seemed to listen to you. In the far corner, you saw initials carved into a beam. 4 letters, scratched into the wood with a small tool, or perhaps a sharp nail. You traced the grooves with your fingertip. The letters felt rough, hand-cut, full of intention. You wondered who had carved them. A girl like you. A boy who worked the night shift. A woman who had spent years at the same machine. Historians often say that carved initials are some of the most intimate clues we have about ordinary workers. They show a desire to be remembered, even if no one ever learns the full story. Near the windows, you found a long wooden bench. A small spool of thread lay on the floor beside it. The thread had faded from a deep red to a soft brown. You picked it up gently, turning it between your fingers. It felt fragile, as if it might crumble if you pressed too hard. You wondered how many hands had passed it along. How many looms had fed it through their iron teeth. How many workers had touched it on busy mornings when the machines were loud and the room was alive with motion. The windows themselves held their own stories. Their glass panes were streaked with dust and faint scratches. When you stood close to them, you could see the outlines of the city through a veil of grime. The canal shimmered below. Workers moved along the streets in their steady procession. Smoke drifted from chimneys in soft grey ribbons. The world outside felt very much alive, yet inside this room, everything held a peaceful stillness. A small object near one of the machines caught your eye. It was a metal bobbin with one end bent slightly out of shape. You lifted it carefully and examined the worn edges. This little tool had once held thread that moved fast enough to blur. Now it sat quietly in your palm, resting after years of work. Archaeologists who study mill sites often find objects like this: bent bobbins, broken shuttles, iron spindles with worn grooves. They use them to learn how people worked, how machines aged, and how the rhythms of daily life took shape. These tiny pieces of metal become clues in the story of a larger world. As you stood in the center of the room, you noticed something else: the faint imprint of footprints in the dust. Not recent ones. These marks were soft around the edges. Someone had walked here long ago. Maybe a supervisor checking the machines before the floor was closed. Maybe a worker returning to retrieve a forgotten tool. Maybe someone, like you, seeking a quiet moment. The sight of those footprints stirred something gentle in your chest, a reminder that places remember people even when the people are long gone. You walked slowly between the machines, careful not to disturb anything. The floor creaked softly under your steps. The air tasted like old wood and distant cotton fibers. You paused beside a loom that looked older than the rest. Its wooden frame was chipped. Its gears were rusted. A small piece of thread still clung to one of its beams. You touched it lightly and imagined the hands that had guided it. The worker who had stood here, the stories that lived in the echo of their presence. Historians sometimes argue about how many mill floors like this existed. Some claim the mills ran every machine constantly. Others say certain rooms were left idle for long periods. The reality is complex. Mill floors changed with seasons, repairs, and shifting demands. But walking through this silent space, you felt the weight of time pressed gently against your shoulders. You sensed the layers of life lived here: work, fatigue, hope, conversation shared in stolen moments, the quiet triumphs of a finished shift, the quiet sorrows of long days. Before you left, you stood for one last moment near the windows. The dust sparkled in the fading light. The silent machines stood like tired giants. The room held its breath. You felt your own breath slow to match its stillness. Then you stepped back through the door, letting it close behind you with a soft thud. The world outside felt louder and brighter than before. Now, in your boarding house room, the memory returns with comforting clarity. The lamplight flickers. The sheets feel soft beneath your hands. The sounds of the house settle into the quiet of the night. You think of that dusty floor and the stories sleeping within it. You think of the initials carved into the beam. You think of the footprints fading into the dust. You breathe slowly, feeling the calm of that silent mill floor fill your chest with a peaceful heaviness. The memory of the silent mill floor settles around you like a shawl, soft and heavy, and for a long moment you simply breathe in the warmth of your boarding house room. The oil lamp glows in a small halo on your table. A faint hint of starch lingers in the hallway. Downstairs, someone adjusts a chair, creating a gentle scrape that echoes through the quiet. As you sit in the calm of this late hour, your thoughts move toward another place inside the mills. A place not filled with machines or dust, but with paper. A place where the stories of workers were once written with careful ink strokes. A place where those stories now fade into silence. You remember standing in a supply room one afternoon, waiting for a spool of thread to be counted and recorded by a bookkeeper. The room was narrow and lined with shelves filled with boxes, tools, spare parts, and stacks of paper bound with string. A small desk sat in the corner. On that desk lay a pile of old ledgers. Their covers were worn, their edges curled, their pages looked tired from years of being turned and touched. The bookkeeper noticed your eyes drifting toward them and smiled in a quiet way. He said you could look at them while you waited. You stepped closer. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight that slipped through the high window. You lifted the top ledger with both hands, careful not to damage the frayed binding. The cover felt soft beneath your fingertips, almost like fabric. You opened it slowly. The first page showed neat columns of names, numbers, and notes. Some entries were clear and sharp, others had faded until they were almost ghosts on the page. As you traced the words, you read names you had never heard before. You felt an odd kind of intimacy with these strangers from years past. There was something touching about seeing their wages recorded, their attendance marked, their fines or bonuses listed. These small details held pieces of their lives. A girl named Ellen had missed 2 days in April. A boy named Thomas had earned a small extra payment for repairing a shuttle. Someone named Mary had worked steady hours for months, then suddenly vanished from the records with no explanation. You turned the page and found more signs of the past. Ink blots where someone wrote in a hurry, lines crossed out and rewritten, marginal notes in a cramped hand, a small doodle in the corner that looked like a flower, drawn perhaps on a slow afternoon when the clerk had time to idle. Historians sometimes speak of how these small marks reveal more about mill life than any official report. They show the human side of bookkeeping, the imperfections, the personalities, the daily moods that shaped each stroke of the quill. As you read further, you notice something that made your breath pause. Gaps in the pages, entire sections missing, torn edges, blurred lines, a few names that ended abruptly, as if the story had jumped ahead and forgotten them. You felt a small heaviness in your chest. What happened to these people? Did they move away? Did they fall ill? Did they decide the mill was too much? Or did someone simply misplace a page in a moment of distraction? Historians still debate the meaning of these gaps. Some believe they reflect instability in mill employment. Others argue that records were often damaged by water, fire, or simple neglect. Whatever the explanation, the silence left behind is its own kind of story. You lifted another ledger from the pile. This one was thicker. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting in a darker ink. A different clerk, perhaps someone with a steadier hand or a more patient temperament. The letters curled with care, as if the writer took pride in each entry. You found notes about repairs, wage changes, and shipments of cotton. You found lists of workers sorted by skill level. You found notations about machinery failures that must have interrupted entire shifts. These details created a picture of how the mill operated long before you ever arrived. You paused over one entry. The name caught your eye because it was so familiar. A girl from Ireland. Her name written in careful script. Her hours tallied. Her wages noted. You wondered if she had stood where you stood. If she had crossed the same bridge over the canal. If she had lived in your boarding house. You studied the numbers beside her name. A week of long hours. A small fine for a late arrival. A bonus for finishing an extra length of cloth. You imagined her life in those details. Her fatigue, her pride, her small victories, her quiet disappointments. It felt like touching a shadow that still held warmth. The bookkeeper returned and placed the thread order on the desk. He told you that some ledgers were so old they were nearly impossible to read. He explained that the mill kept many records, but not all survived. Some were lost when buildings were repaired, others were damaged by water during storms. A few were simply discarded when they were no longer needed. He said it in a practical voice, but you felt a small sadness at the thought. Paper is fragile, and so are the stories it carries. You closed the ledger gently and placed it back on the stack. The dust on your fingertips glimmered faintly in the light. You looked around the room with new eyes. You realized that these shelves held not only tools and supplies, but memories, names that once belonged to people who laughed, worked, worried, and hoped just as you did. People whose stories might never be fully known simply because a drawer stuck, or a page tore, or a clerk ran out of ink. When you stepped out of the supply room, the air in the hallway felt cool and bright. You heard the distant rumble of machinery. Workers moved in steady lines. A girl hurried past you with a basket of thread. A supervisor called instructions from across the room. Life continued, full of motion, full of noise. Yet the quiet world of the ledgers lingered in your mind. The soft pages, the fading ink, the unfinished stories that rested between lines. Now, back in your boarding house room, you leaned forward slightly and let your elbows rest on your knees. You imagine the ledgers waiting in their narrow shelves. You imagine the forgotten names sleeping inside them. You imagine the traces of the past held in ink and dust. You breathe slowly and feel a gentle reverence settle into your chest. The mills are loud and full of life, but some of their deepest stories whisper from quiet pages. You close your eyes and listen for those whispers, faint as they are, and let them fold into the stillness of the night. You sit quietly at the small table beside your bed, and the lamplight paints a soft, golden circle across the wood. Outside your window, the night feels deep and velvet dark, touched only by the faint glimmer of a distant street lamp reflecting off the canal. In this calm silence, another memory from the mill rises gently into your thoughts. A memory of a place that held entire worlds inside wooden boxes. A place where the past waited patiently to be found. The attic storage rooms. It began on a late afternoon when the housemother asked for volunteers to help clean the upper floor of the boarding house. Dust had gathered there during the humid summer months. A few mice had left small trails along the beams. The attic was a place most girls avoided unless they had business there. The ceiling was low. The smell of old cloth hung in the air. But you volunteered, partly out of kindness and partly out of curiosity. You had heard the other girls whisper that the attic contained trunks left behind by workers who had moved on or vanished from the ledgers. Forgotten belongings, forgotten stories. You wanted to see if those whispers were true. The stairs to the attic were narrow and steep. You held onto the railing as you climbed, feeling the wood smooth beneath your fingers. At the top, you pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust swirled in the sunlight that slipped through a small window. The air felt warm and still. Wooden beams stretched overhead like the ribs of a great sleeping animal. The floorboards creaked under your feet in long, low notes. Several trunks sat in a corner, stacked unevenly and covered with a layer of dust. Some were simple boxes with plain lids. Others had brass corners and worn leather straps. A few were locked, though the keys had long since disappeared. The housemother told you that many trunks had belonged to girls who left abruptly. Some returned home, some married. Some found work in other towns, and some simply vanished from the records without explanation. Historians often note how common such disappearances were in mill communities. Not every departure was dramatic. Many were quiet, sudden, unrecorded beyond a single missing name in a ledger. You approached the nearest trunk. Its wooden surface felt dry and faintly rough. You brushed away a layer of dust, revealing initials burned into the lid. You wondered who those initials had belonged to. You lifted the lid carefully. The hinges creaked as if happy to be noticed after so long. Inside you found a folded dress made of faded calico. The fabric felt soft at the seams but crisp where it had not been touched in years. Beneath the dress lay a ribbon in a delicate lavender shade. The color had dulled with time but still held a surprising hint of brightness. You held the ribbon between your fingers and imagined a girl tying it into her hair before walking to the mills on a warm spring morning. Beside the ribbon lay a small envelope. The paper was yellowed with age. The name on the front was written in a careful hand. You opened it slowly, afraid the fragile paper might tear. Inside you found a letter written in looping script. The ink had faded until some lines were nearly impossible to read. You held it up to the narrow beam of sunlight and tried to decipher the words. The letter spoke of home, of a mother's garden, of brothers who had grown taller, of the scent of peat smoke drifting through the village in the evening. The writer promised to send wages soon. She hoped her family was well. She hoped the winter would not be too harsh. You folded the letter gently and placed it back in the envelope. Historians still debate how many letters like this were lost or abandoned. Some argue that girls who left quickly often left belongings behind. Others say that trunks were sometimes kept as collateral when workers owed rent. The truth is scattered across incomplete records and half-remembered stories. But standing in that attic, with the letter trembling faintly in your hands, you felt the truth of how easily small pieces of a life could be left behind, not discarded, just forgotten in the rush of change. You opened another trunk. This one was smaller and lined with fabric that had once been blue. Inside, you found a pair of gloves, neatly folded, along with a small notebook. The notebook's cover was cracked at the edges. You opened it to the first page. Someone had written short lists. Items purchased. Items hoped for. New shoes. A comb. A candle. A small collection of coins. Another page held simple sketches. Flowers. Leaves. The corner of a loom. A worker's profile drawn with gentle strokes. You smiled at the sight. It felt like a window into the quiet mind of someone who had sought small beauty in the midst of long hours. Farther back in the attic, you found a trunk with a broken latch. Inside was a small wooden box with a sliding lid. You opened the box and found a handful of keepsakes, a thimble, a button carved from bone, a scrap of lace, a tiny book of hymns. The pages were thin and worn, suggesting it had been used often. You touched the worn corner of the book with your thumb and wondered if the girl who owned it had sung these hymns with a quiet voice while sewing in the evenings, much like the girls in your own boarding house did now. One trunk held nothing but clothing. Aprons patched in several places, wool stockings, a pair of shoes with soles worn thin. You lifted one of the shoes gently. The leather was soft from use. You imagined the long hours those shoes had walked in the mill, the countless steps across the wooden floor, the ways they had shaped themselves to the foot of a girl you would never meet. Clothing, historians say, is one of the most revealing remnants of working-class life. It shows the wear of labor, the repair of care, the thread of identity woven in each mended seam. As you sorted through the trunks, you felt a softness settle inside you. These forgotten belongings were not just objects, they were echoes. They held the shape of people's lives, their hopes, their routines, their small joys, their quiet sorrows. Their presence lingered in the folded fabrics and faded ink. When the sun dipped lower, the attic grew dim. Dust floated in the air like drifting lanterns. You closed each trunk with care. You brushed away only enough dust to see the initials clearly. You did not want to disturb the rest. The house mother thanked you for helping. She did not ask what you found. Perhaps she knew that these trunks held stories worth keeping silent. Now, in your room with the oil lamp glowing softly beside you, the memory of the attic warms your thoughts. You think of the letters, the ribbons, the notebooks, the shoes worn thin by long days. You imagine the girls who once packed these trunks with trembling hands and hopeful hearts. You feel a quiet kinship with them. Their stories may be faded, but they rest gently inside the memory of the boarding house, held safe by time. You breathe slowly and let that kinship settle across your chest like a quilt. The trunks may remain closed again, but their stories stay open in your mind. You lean back slightly in your chair and let the memory of the attic trunks settle like dust floating through a beam of lamplight. Outside, the night rests quietly over Lowell. The canal has stilled. The boarding house walls give off a faint warmth from the kitchen, fires below. It is in these peaceful hours that your mind drifts toward the objects that defined your working days. The tools. The little pieces of wood and metal that shaped the entire world of the mills. Objects so ordinary that people rarely planned to save them. Yet they held more stories than most letters ever could. You picture the weaving room again. Not the one filled with roaring machines during the day, but the quiet room you sometimes passed through long after the shift had ended. In those rare moments, the floor felt hushed. The machines stood like sentinels at rest, and scattered across benches, boxes, and work tables lay the tools of the trade. Small enough to fit in your hand, significant enough to shape the fabric of your life. You remember an afternoon when the overseer asked you to bring him a new set of bobbins. He pointed toward a small cabinet tucked beneath a window. The cabinet was full of little drawers with hand-lettered labels. Some drawers stuck slightly and required a gentle tug. You opened one and saw a row of wooden bobbins arranged neatly like sleeping birds. Each bobbin was smooth to the touch. Their surfaces had been worn down by years of thread passing across them in fast, steady motion. Some were pale from fresh wood, others were darkened by oil and age. You picked one up with care, feeling how light it was, hollow in the center, balanced perfectly so the thread could unwind without snagging. Bobbins fascinated you more than you expected. They seemed simple, yet everything about them mattered. Their size, their weight, the quality of their wood, the shape of their ends. Even a small flaw could cause the thread to catch or snap. Historians who study mills often mention bobbins as some of the most common artifacts found at old mill sites. They turned up in piles near former canals, in storage sheds, and in abandoned workshops. Some were burned, some were warped by dampness, some remained nearly perfect. These little pieces of wood reveal how cloth was made one rotation at a time. Near the bobbin cabinet sat a long table where workers sometimes repaired shuttles. A shuttle, in its simplest form, was a tool used to carry the thread back and forth across the loom. When you first saw one, you thought it looked like a small wooden boat, thin and pointed at both ends. Inside was a hollow space where the bobbin fit snugly. The shuttle glided across the warped threads with a swift, smooth motion. When you worked at the loom, the movement of the shuttle became so familiar that you could almost sense its path even when you closed your eyes. Once, when the machines were silent for repairs, you held a shuttle in both hands. You turned it over slowly. The wood was polished by years of use. The grain showed faint patterns that resembled ripples in water. Along the edges you saw tiny dents and scratches, marks made by countless workers who had guided it through the loom. On one end, a small fragment of thread had caught in a notch. It looked delicate, as if a single breath might make it drift away. You touched it gently and imagined the girl who last used that shuttle. Maybe she hummed while she worked. Maybe she counted the beats of her steps on the creaking floor. Maybe she dreamed of home as she watched the thread fly. Among the most interesting tools were the threading hooks. They were small metal pieces with thin, curved ends. Workers used them to pull the thread through narrow spaces in the loom. Without them, you could not prepare the warp correctly. They were so light they barely weighed more than a coin. You remember keeping one tucked into your apron pocket, always ready when you needed it. The metal felt cool at first and then warmed with use. You often ran your thumb over its curved end when you were thinking. It became a small comfort during long shifts. The overseer once explained that threading hooks rarely survive for long. They bent easily. They were often lost. Sometimes they slipped between floorboards. Sometimes they were swept away with piles of thread waste. Historians who find them in excavation sites treat them almost like treasures. A single hook can reveal the type of loom used in a particular room and the skill of the workers who handled it. These tiny tools, forgotten in the rhythm of daily labor, become clues that help modern scholars build a picture of mill life. There were other tools too. Oil cans with long spouts used to keep the machines moving smoothly. Metal gears stored in crates for emergency repairs. Wooden racks for holding spools. Small iron weights wrapped in cloth to adjust tension. Every object had a purpose. Every tool held a place in the larger machinery of the mill. You rarely thought about these pieces during a busy day. They were simply there, within reach, familiar as the beating of your own heart. One afternoon you watched an older mechanic handle a broken spindle. He held it carefully, inspected its grooves, and murmured that he could tell how long it had been used by the way the metal shone in certain places. He said that the spindle had its own memory, that the wear on its surface showed how fast a worker had moved, how steady her hands were, and how smooth the machine had been running. He wiped his fingers on a cloth and said that tools carry stories even when people forget to write theirs down. You remembered that sentence because it felt true in a way you could feel deep inside your chest. Historians now say that such observations were remarkably accurate. Tools do carry stories. The patterns of wear, the broken ends, the smoothness of a handle. All of these details reveal how people lived, worked, and learned. Some scholars debate how much can truly be understood from these objects. Others insist that material culture offers a view into everyday life that written records cannot provide. You have seen enough tools in those quiet corners of the mill to believe the latter. The machines may tell you how cloth is made, but the tools tell you who made it. You recall one last image from that day. A small wooden tray filled with fragments, bits of broken shuttles, splintered ends of bobbins, a piece of metal shaped like a tiny claw. These fragments seemed useless at first, but the overseer explained that workers often saved them for later. A broken shuttle could become a teaching tool. A snapped bobbin could be reshaped. A metal fragment might fit into a new mechanism. Nothing was entirely cast aside unless it was beyond repair. You lifted one small fragment from the tray, a splintered piece of dark wood with a faint groove carved along its length. It felt like the memory of a tool, an echo. You held it for a moment, wondering who last touched it and why it had broken. Then you placed it back with care. Now, sitting in your quiet room with the soft glow of lamplight around you, you think of those tools again. The bobbins, the shuttles, the hooks, the fragments. You realize how much they have shaped your understanding of the mill. These objects, so small and humble, carry the weight of countless stories. They are reminders that history is not only found in ledgers or grand events, it is found in the worn edges of tools held by ordinary hands. You breathe slowly. You let that truth settle in your chest. The tools of the mill rest in the quiet corners of your memory, steady and familiar, guiding you gently toward what comes next. You sit quietly on the edge of your bed, letting the peaceful stillness of the boarding house wrap around you like a familiar shawl. The oil lamp on your table flickers in a small, steady rhythm. The wooden walls give off a faint scent of old pine warmed by the heat that rises from the kitchen. Outside, the night settles in with calm certainty. Somewhere across town, a dog barks once and then falls silent. These gentle sounds make you think of the places beyond the mills. Places where life moves at a different speed. Places filled with comforts that you have only glimpsed in rare moments. The genteel parlors of wealthier Lowell families. You remember the first time you saw one up close. It happened after a Sunday church service. The weather was cool and bright. The leaves rustled softly overhead as people walked along the street in conversation. One of the overseers lived nearby, in a house that seemed almost grand compared to the boarding house where you slept. His wife invited several mill girls for tea that afternoon. The invitation felt surprisingly warm. She said she admired the discipline of the workers and wanted to offer a moment of rest. You followed the small group of girls toward the row of houses near the main street, unsure what to expect. When you reached the house, the first thing you noticed was the front door. It was painted a deep green, polished to a shine, and had a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. You stood outside for a moment, looking at its bright gleam, feeling an unexpected flutter of nerves in your stomach. The house mother often said that the wealthier parts of town felt like a different world. You were about to step into that world. Inside the parlor, everything felt soft and warm. Rich carpets covered the floors in patterns of red and gold. Curtains of velvet and lace draped around the tall windows. A large clock ticked quietly on the mantel. The chairs were upholstered in fabric that looked as delicate as any fine dress. You hesitated before sitting down, afraid you might crease the cushion. A girl beside you whispered that she felt the same. You both shared an amused glance, and the tension eased a little. The overseer's wife poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot painted with blue flowers. The cups were thin enough that you could see a faint glow through them when the light hit just right. She served small cakes that tasted of sugar and lemon peel. You felt almost shy taking one, as if these treats were meant only for people who lived behind polished doors. But she insisted warmly, and you relaxed enough to enjoy the sweetness on your tongue. As you sat there, you observed the parlor closely. A polished mirror hung above the fireplace. Its surface reflected the sunlight in soft, dancing lines across the opposite wall. Shelves beside the window held small ceramic figurines arranged with careful symmetry. A bookshelf displayed volumes bound in dark leather with gold lettering on the spines. You ran your eyes along the titles. Some were novels, some were books of sermons, others were volumes of poetry. You wondered what it might be like to read them all at leisure, without worrying about the whistle that would call you back to the mills. The conversation in the room was gentle. The overseer's wife asked about your families. She asked how you liked Lowell. She asked if you were settling well in the boarding house. You answered politely, though you kept your words simple. You did not want to say anything that might sound foolish. She smiled when you spoke and said she admired the strength of young women who came so far from home to work. You felt a small warmth bloom in your chest at her kindness. Yet even as the room filled with soft chatter, you could not help noticing the differences between your life and hers. Her hands were smooth. Her dress was made from fabric that looked expensive. Her shoes made no sound when she crossed the carpet. She spoke of music lessons and garden societies. She mentioned hosting dinner guests. All of it felt like a world you could see, but not quite reach. A world separated from yours by more than just distance. Historians still debate how much interaction existed between mill workers and the city's wealthier families. Some say the communities were closely tied because the mills shaped every part of the city. Others argue that the social divide was wide and rarely crossed. The truth probably lives somewhere between these ideas. In your experience, glimpses into affluent homes were rare but meaningful. They showed you that the town held many layers, each with its own rhythm and expectations. After tea, the overseer's wife showed you the sitting room. A large rug covered the floor, soft beneath your shoes. Portraits hung on the walls. A vase of fresh flowers stood on a table. She said she changed the flowers every few days to keep the room cheerful. It was a small detail, but it struck you. Fresh flowers were a luxury you never saw in the boarding house. Your own room smelled of oil lamp and laundry soap. Pleasant smells, yes, but nothing like the sweet fragrance of roses and violets. You noticed a piano against one wall. Its polished wood gleamed in the afternoon light. The woman encouraged one of the girls to try playing a familiar tune. The girl sat hesitantly and pressed a few keys. The notes floated through the room like warm breath. Everyone grew still for a moment. Music had a way of filling even the softest spaces. The afternoon passed gently, and soon it was time to return to the boarding house. As you stepped back outside, the brightness of the sun felt different than it had on your way in. The world seemed sharper, more vivid. The noise of the street returned. The smell of coal smoke drifted through the air. The overseer's house stood behind you, calm and polished. Ahead lay the familiar path lined with modest buildings, crowded streets, and the sound of workers heading home for the evening. When you reached the boarding house, you climbed the stairs to your small room. The floorboards creaked beneath your feet. The quilt on your bed looked slightly crooked. Your wash basin sat in its usual place. These simple things felt comforting. They were yours. They held your life. Yet the memory of the Genteel parlor remained, lingering like a faint scent of perfume on your sleeve. Now, as you sit in your room with the oil lamp glowing softly beside you, the contrast settles gently in your mind. Two worlds in the same town, two rhythms that rarely overlap. You do not feel envy exactly. What you feel is understanding. A sense of how wide Lowell is, how many lives it holds behind its brick walls and canal paths. You breathe slowly and let that understanding rest in your chest, like a quiet truth. You rest your hands on the folded quilt at the foot of your bed and let the memory of the Genteel parlor drift softly into the warm hush of your boarding house room. The lamp on your table burns low, turning the shadows into long, gentle shapes along the wall. The house creaks in a familiar rhythm as people settle into their rooms for the night. Down the hall, someone whispers goodnight. A floorboard sighs. These quiet sounds remind you where you belong. But they also bring back the vivid contrast between this world and the world you glimpsed across town. A contrast that reveals itself most clearly in the small routines of daily life. Meals, manners, evenings, the rhythms that separate one class from another as surely as the canal divides the mill district from the leafy streets beyond. You think first of the meals. In the boarding house, breakfast is simple and quick. Porridge ladled into tin bowls, thick slices of bread, a mug of weak tea. The housemother keeps a brisk eye on the table, urging everyone to eat with purpose so they are not late for the morning whistle. Conversation is allowed, but only in gentle tones. The room smells of boiled oats and soap from the freshly scrubbed floor. Chairs scrape, spoons tap. Everything moves with quiet efficiency. In the afternoons at the mill dining hall, lunch appears in a similar fashion. Stew thick with potatoes, bread that sometimes crumbles too easily, a pitcher of water passed from hand to hand. Workers sit shoulder to shoulder. Some fold their hands and bow their heads before eating. Others waste no time at all. You have learned to eat quickly but calmly, because the machines wait for no one. Food here is fuel. Humble, predictable, necessary. Now compare this with the table you saw in the overseer's home. The tea service laid out on polished wood. The porcelain cups thin enough to glow. The scent of lemon cakes. A small dish of berries preserved from summer. Every movement at that table was slow, intentional. There was time for conversation, time for a second cup, time to set a spoon down delicately instead of sliding a bowl aside before running off to a shift. You felt almost clumsy in such a place, not unwelcome, just aware that you were stepping into a world where the pace of life followed a different clock. Even the manners of the two worlds diverged. In the boarding house, girls speak plainly. They pass dishes across the table with practical hands. They laugh quietly at shared jokes. They wipe crumbs from their aprons with unself-conscious ease. In the parlor you visited, movements were smaller and more contained. People folded their hands in their laps. They waited for the hostess to take the first sip. They dabbed at their mouths with soft linen napkins instead of wiping them clean with the back of a hand. These differences were not taught to you in any rulebook. You simply felt them as soon as you stepped through the door. Clothing reveals its own kind of truth. Mill girls wear dresses made from sturdy fabrics. Wool in the winter, calico in the summer, aprons patched many times over. The hems often show the wear of long hours on wooden floors. These clothes hold the scent of oil, steam, and cotton. By contrast, the wardrobes of city elites hold garments meant for display as much as practicality. Silk shawls, dresses with delicate trim, gloves that seem made for warm hands rather than worn ones. You noticed how the overseer's wife moved without worrying about catching a sleeve on a loom or staining a cuff with machine oil. Her clothing belonged to a world free from the hazards of factory work. Evenings are where the contrast becomes most striking. After supper in the boarding house, the atmosphere shifts into a cozy, quiet. Girls gather to sew, read, or mend their stockings. Some rehearse lines from books borrowed from a tiny shelf near the stairwell. Others sit by the window and talk about family or dreams or simple things like the weather. Voices stay low because everyone is tired. The day has pulled much from their bodies. There is warmth in this tiredness, a shared sense of survival and routine. But across town, evenings unfold differently. You have heard about the gatherings in parlors, gentle music from a piano, soft laughter, guests arriving in neat carriages, candles burning in polished holders, people discussing plays, lectures, or new inventions. A father reading aloud from a newspaper while his children sit curled in upholstered chairs. A mother writing letters in a quiet corner. Their evenings stretch long into comfort, not recovery. They do not depend on the whistle's mercy. Their time belongs to them. Historians still discuss how wide the gap between these two worlds truly was. Some argue that class boundaries were rigid, marked clearly by wages and status. Others claim the lines blurred, especially in mill towns where everyone lived within the same few miles. But as you think back on that Genteel parlor and the way you felt when you returned to your modest room, you sense the truth in your bones. The divide was real, not harsh or cruel in every moment, but present, firm, quietly shaping everything from how one ate to how one rested. You remember the feeling when you stepped back onto the boarding house porch after visiting the overseer's home. The air felt cooler. The boards beneath your feet were rougher. The lamps inside glowed a more humble shade of yellow. You removed your shawl and realized it carried the faint scent of the parlor's flowers, a scent that did not quite belong here. Yet you also felt a familiar comfort when you entered your room. The quilt on your bed, the wash basin at its simple stand, the sound of a girl humming softly 2 rooms down. These were the rhythms you understood. You do not resent the differences. You simply see them. You hold them gently in mind as 2 truths that exist side by side. Lowell is wide enough for both worlds, and you stand in the one that has shaped your hands, your schedule, your strength, and your quiet hopes. Now, as the lamp flickers and softens, you breathe deeply and let the memory settle. The parlor across town glows in your thoughts for a moment longer before fading into the warm hush of your boarding house. 2 evenings, 2 worlds, and you, resting peacefully between them. You sit with the memory of divided evenings, resting softly in your thoughts, and after a moment you rise from your bed and walk toward the small window that overlooks the street. The glass is cool beneath your fingertips. Outside, the night folds itself over Lowell like a warm quilt. The sky holds a deep blue that almost feels velvet. Lamps glow faintly along the canal paths. A few people linger on porches before stepping inside for the night. In this gentle quiet, you feel an unexpected urge to walk. Not far, just enough to let your mind breathe. You wrap your shawl around your shoulders and step into the hallway. The floorboards creak softly beneath your feet. A girl whispers goodnight as she blows out her lamp. Another adjusts her blanket and settles in with a sigh. You descend the narrow stairs and step outside, greeted by a mild breeze that carries the faint scent of cotton and damp wood. The boarding house door closes behind you with a familiar click, and you begin to walk down the small path that leads toward the canal. The city feels different at night, calmer, softer. During the day, the streets pulse with movement, but now the noise has quieted to a low hum. The water in the canal moves in slow, patient ripples. You pause on the footbridge and rest your hands on the wooden rail. The boards beneath your shoes feel worn but steady. The reflection of the lamps shimmers on the water like scattered coins. You inhale deeply and let the stillness settle into your chest. As you walk farther, you pass rows of mill buildings standing tall and silent in the moonlight. Their brick walls glow faintly. Their tall windows reflect the sky. During the day, these factories roar with sound. At night, they rest like tired giants. You stop for a moment to look up at one of the windows. Inside, you can almost imagine the still shapes of the machines, the looms waiting for morning, the bobbins catching the faintest glint of moonlight, the shuttles resting exactly where the last worker placed them. You feel a small tenderness for the mills in this state. Even the machines deserve a quiet moment. You continue walking along the canal path. The stones beneath your feet crunch softly. Across the water, you see a row of houses where warm light spills from the windows. A mother sits in a rocker. A child yawns and rubs sleepy eyes. A man reads a newspaper by lamplight. These small glimpses feel comforting. They remind you that life here is broad and varied, that your world and theirs coexist in the same night air. You pass a bakery with its shutters closed. The faint scent of yeast and flour lingers in the air. You imagine the baker sleeping now, preparing for an early morning when he will knead dough before the sun rises. You walk by a tailor's shop. The dark window reflects your figure as you move. Spools of thread sit inside on a shelf, faintly visible in the dim light. You think of your own thread at the mill. How many hands touch these small tools? How many lives shift quietly around them? You also pass a larger home with a small garden in front. Roses grow along a wooden fence. Their scent drifts into the path with a soft sweetness. You pause and admire the calm beauty of the flowers. Someone inside plays a piano. The notes drift through an open window. They sound slow and deliberate. A simple tune played, not for an audience, but for pleasure. You close your eyes and listen. The music reminds you of the Genteel parlor you visited. The polished furniture, the delicate cups, the gentle pace of conversation. You feel the contrast again, but it no longer feels sharp. Instead, it feels like the two worlds rest gently beside each other, each holding its own truth. You walk until the music fades into the night air. Then you turn and begin the quiet journey back to the boarding house. Each step feels soft and measured. Your shawl pulls warmth around your shoulders. The lamps flicker in quiet patterns across the ground. The hum of distant voices grows fainter. You feel your breath slow into a peaceful rhythm. When you reach the boarding house, the front door gives a familiar sound as you open it. Inside, the staircase glows with low lamplight. You climb gently, careful not to disturb anyone. The hallway is dark, except for the flicker of a lamp left burning for late returners. You slip into your room and close the door behind you with a quiet click. Your small room feels warm and welcoming. The quilt on your bed waits with gentle folds. The wash basin rests in its usual place. The oil lamp casts a calm glow across the wooden boards. The scent of soap and starch hangs lightly in the air. You sit on the edge of your bed and unpin your hair. Your fingers move slowly, as if following the unhurried rhythm of your night walk. You place your shawl on the chair. You smooth your bedding. You take a slow breath and feel your shoulders relax. The room carries the peaceful weight of routine, a weight that comforts rather than burdens. You think of the entire day and how each moment has led you here. The mill, the tools, the letters, the memories, the glimpses of other lives. All of it flows together like threads woven into cloth. You slip beneath your quilt and settle your head against the pillow. The sounds of the house around you sink into a soft hum. A door closes gently. A girl sighs. The wind brushes a faint note against the window pane. These small sounds create a lullaby of ordinary life. Ordinary, but full of meaning. You close your eyes, and the light from the lamp dims behind your eyelids. You think of the canal under moonlight, the mills in their quiet stance, the soft glow of parlors across town, the boarding house hallways that form the steady rhythm of your days. You feel grateful for the routine, for the strength you have found, for the memories that guide you gently into rest. And now the wind down begins. You allow every part of your body to settle more deeply into the mattress. Your breath slows, your mind softens, the room grows quieter with each passing moment. The lamplight flickers and fades, turning the world into a warm blur. You imagine the floorboards beneath you holding steady, the cool window pane keeping the night air outside, the soft quilt wrapping your body just enough to keep you warm. You feel your heartbeat slow to a peaceful pace. You picture the canal at night one last time, the water shimmering, the lamps glowing, the mills resting, the world gently holding its breath. You imagine yourself floating in that calm darkness, safe and unhurried. You let the memory wash over you like a quiet tide. Each moment becomes softer, each sound becomes distant. Your thoughts drift like small boats on still water. You feel the weight of sleep rising gently from within. Not heavy, just steady, warm, certain. You release the day as if loosening a ribbon. You let your breathing grow slow and even. You feel every muscle soften, every worry fade. The night wraps around you like a familiar friend. Your bed becomes a small harbor. Your body becomes light. The world becomes quiet, and you rest.